One of the kind of side effects of spending 20 years in church leadership as I have, and in local churches of different sizes and on 2 continents, and now working for a global church planting organization, is that you just kind of become obsessed with learning about organizational health. I mean, what is it that makes for a healthy church and an unhealthy church? What is it that makes for a healthy business or an unhealthy business? A healthy sports franchise or an unhealthy sports franchise? Why do the Cubs go 80 years without winning a World Series? And other teams seem to win it all the time. Maybe you've been on a set and you've realized like there are healthy sets and unhealthy sets. There's a healthy production company that you want to work for again, and that other one that is toxic and dysfunctional, and you are not taking that job. How does that happen? I mean, what is the difference? Why do some of these organizations run like mature, well-functioning, cohesive teams, and then others just either fail to thrive for the long term? They might start well, but they can't keep it up. Or they just, from the beginning, seem to have kind of a toxic and dysfunctional vibe to them that ends up wearing people out and sometimes even abusing people. And one of the things that I've learned in kind of studying this is that it's a huge challenge to create a sense of unity amidst the diversity of functions that are essential in any organization. And if you just think about a large business, you think about all the organizational functions that have to exist for that business to go well. You've got HR and finance, and then a sales and marketing team, an operation and productions team, a management and executive team, a research and design team, an IT support team, and all these different teams fulfilling all these different functions with people who are uniquely gifted, often in that area, and yet they all have to find a way to work together. And yet the nature of having these different functions and different teams and different giftings is that they tend to operate in their own little silo, and they tend to only think about themselves. And then by nature, they compete with the other departments for resources. Maybe you've seen them. Maybe you've been part of an organization where, R&D wants to have more money to design that new product, but marketing is out there saying, if you don't build our budget up, we won't have any money to sell your product. Or maybe HR wants to run a seminar on workplace safety because that's important. There's been injuries on the factory floor, and yet management says, no, we have to use that time to do an offsite and kind of build some camaraderie and help our culture. And everyone's fighting to figure out which of these priorities will work. And so the key to organizational health is often not just that you as a department serve your function well, but that you also serve and support the other departments. That there's this sense of unity amidst the diversity. And the best analogy for this is just the human body. In fact, the Latin word for corporation comes from the idea of a body. It's a combination of parts that work as a whole. That's what a corporation is meant to be. And so the human body has all these separate systems and functions that often kind of operate to do their own thing, but they work well with the rest of the systems and functions. And if one doesn't work well, it often spreads over into the others because of that interconnection. So a healthy human body becomes this great analogy for a healthy organization or a healthy team. Now, if you want to learn more about how to manage this tension, right, how to not get into silos and how to handle allocation of resources and to keep everyone happy, you can just go right down to San Fernando and walk to Barnes & Noble's, and there's like 3 whole walls of just executive management leadership books for all this, right? But I can also tell you, if you don't want to do that, just read Ephesians chapter 4. Because this is probably one of the best cliff notes you'll find in the entire Bible for this concept of unity amidst diversity. Paul's going to offer this master class in this short little chapter today on how the body of Christ, how we as a unit, an organism, not just an organization, but a living, breathing entity made up of living parts, how do we express unity amidst diversity as we move towards maturity? And Ephesians 4 covers the behaviors that we need to promote unity. It covers the diverse functions that have a tendency to fight against each other and to compete. And Paul's going to kind of give this overview of what I like to call the 5 functions of a healthy church. The 5 essential ways that the church needs to operate in order to fulfill or present the fullness of Christ in the world. So if you're new today, we're in a series where we've been walking through the book of Ephesians. The series is called Plant the Gospel. And each week, whoever's been teaching has been taking kind of a few verses and expanding on those verses to make a point about how the church can be a better reflection of Jesus. We want to move beyond churchianity, this kind of washed down version of cultural Christianity. We want to move beyond that and really get back to the essence of being Christ in the world. And so today I'm going to stretch the definition of the word few and look at a few verses, by which I mean 16. But I promise we're going to move fast, and we'll get to the heart of the text here in verse 7 pretty quick. But why don't we dive in with Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. And Paul writes this, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received." Now, Paul's there. For 3 chapters, Paul has been making this point that you, as the body of Christ, you have a calling. God has called you to something, and that calling is to be God's people filled with God's Spirit, living out the fullness of Christ in the world. He said, I want you to think of yourself as a collection of little Jesuses all over the city of Ephesus. And part of your goal then is to multiply and reproduce, and as TD taught on last week, make disciples that kind of make other little Jesuses that can then go out and fill the surrounding areas and ultimately fill the world with little Jesuses that represent the nature of God. So that's our calling. How do we do that? Verse 2, Paul says, "Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." Whenever I read Paul, it's the adverbs that get me. It's not the nouns, it's the adverbs. Paul says, be completely humble. I'm like, why can't I just be like partially humble? Just like relatively humble, more humble than my mother was. Is that good enough, Paul? No, be completely humble. Where he says, make every effort to keep unity. How about just a respectable effort? Just some effort, half-hearted effort. I can do that some days, but no, completely humble, every effort. Paul is stressing these behaviors that we need to embody in order to generate unity. It's the same sort of behaviors that any corporation could benefit from expressing on a regular basis. Humility, gentleness, patience, love. As we embody those things, that helps promote unity. But he goes on to say in verse 4, unity also comes from the fact that we have so much in common as a church community here, just like the church in Ephesus. He says there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Paul starts making a list of all the things we have in common, the ones that many people, all have one faith and one hope and one baptism. And he could just keep going on with an extensive list. He could just fill a whole page. But in Jewish culture, the way you summarize an extensive list is just by naming 7 things. 7 is like the number of perfection, the number of completion. There's 7 days of creation. By the 7th day, it was all done. So Paul just says, let me list 7 things that we have in common to make the point that we have so much in common that should bring us together and create unity. And then he goes on in verse 7 and says, but, and this is a big but to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. Now, if you know anything about kind of biblical Greek, the word grace there can also be translated as gift. It's something that's freely given, something that is not earned. Another translation, I think it's the New Living, says that he has given each one of us a special gift through the generosity of Christ. So they just go ahead and cut the word grace out and get right to this idea of a gift that has been given. And then he goes on and Paul writes, this is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. And what does he ascended mean except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. Like, can I just confess something? For like 20 years of my faith, I just skipped that whole part of this chapter. And like half of it's in parentheses anyway. Like, it can't be important if it's in parentheses, right? I had no idea what this talked about, the ascending and the descending, and the one who ascended higher is the one who descended lower. And I'm like, whatever, what's next? But like in the last 10 years, I've come to understand the beauty of what's happening right here. And in many ways, what he is talking about right here is the pivot or the hinge point of this whole argument that he's going to make. See, what Paul is doing there when he talks about, quote, he ascended on high and he took many captives and gave gifts to the people, he's actually quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting Psalm 68. And Psalm 68 is a song that praises God as the victorious king. It's called a victory psalm. It's an ode to God as the conquering king who has defeated evil. And in this psalm, he's going to describe what happens when a king goes off to battle and then wins a war and returns. So this is quoting now from Psalm 68. Not the part that makes it into Ephesians 4, but the part that leads up to the part Paul quoted. Got me? He says, when you, God, went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth shook. Kings and armies flee in haste. The Almighty scattered the kings of the land. The chariots of God are tens of thousands. And when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. So here's the imagery of Psalm 68. Okay, it's like a king or a prince who is going out to battle. So he literally would step down from his throne, the place that he would rule over his kingdom, and decide it's time to go to war. There's a threat. And so I will now lead our troops as the king or the prince. I will lead us out into battle. And we will go out into a foreign land and we will conquer or fight against this enemy nation that is hostile. And ideally, we will defeat them. We will take members of them captive as a sign of generosity rather than just annihilating all of them. We'll take some of them captive. We will plunder the booty, so to speak, right? We'll take all their money. We'll go into the storehouse and take all their riches with us. And then we will return back home. And so the image here is of a victory parade that is coming back, right? So you've probably seen this scene in films. Like it's in Phantom Menace at the end. A lot of Star Wars films have this kind of victory parade finish. It's in Aladdin. There's a scene in Aladdin where Aladdin, when he's acting as he's the prince, he starts like throwing gold out. I think he's riding on an elephant or something down. But we've all seen this image of a victory parade where, the soldiers come in first, and then after that, they bring in maybe the captives, and they jeer and throw tomatoes at them. And then at the very end is the conquering king or the prince sitting on his throne. And one of the things that happens in these parades is that the spoils of war, the riches, are often, the treasure is opened up, and the soldiers and those who serve the king would reach in and grab gold, jewels, and throw it to the crowd. So this is why the 4th of July, which is the American Victory Parade, if you've ever been to a small town 4th of July parade, why do kids want to go to a 4th of July parade? They throw candy, right? There's someone on a float grabbing candy and throwing it out to the people. It's a way of saying, hey, we are the victors, but you get to participate in the spoils of war. It was an act of generosity from the king. It was an act of benevolence. Rather than just hoarding all these riches, he's saying, no, I represent you, and I went out and I conquered, and I got the victory, but you get some of the reward. You start to see the analogy here? Paul is making the point that in the same way that a king would go out geographically to another land and come back, Jesus Christ has descended into the depths of hell in his death and fought the battle over evil. And in winning it, he has now resurrected to earth and then eventually ascended to the highest region. It's that same image of going out and coming back. He left the throne, came to earth, went to hell, came back to earth, is now back on the throne in heaven. He is the conquering king. But he is not hoarding the riches. On his way back, he is throwing riches out. He's giving gifts to the people. And so the point he's making, he's using this analogy of what a king does to say that Jesus himself has given gifts to the whole community. So not only do we get the gift, the benefit of salvation, that Jesus did something we could never do, and he purchased, he ransomed us, he rescued us out of captivity, and he has given us the gift of salvation. The enemy is defeated. But apparently we also get some other sort of gift from this treasury that Jesus seems to have reclaimed. And so that's why in verse 7 he says, to each one of us a gift has been given by Jesus. So do you want to know what your gift is? Right? It's like Oprah, you get a gift, you get a gift, you get a gift. Let's find out what our gift is. It's under your seat, look. No. Let's open our gifts. There are 5 of them, verses 11 to 13. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, I'm changing that word from pastors, I'll tell you why in a minute, and teachers, to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. He mentions these 5 gifts. These are expressed as individuals or individual gifts that also really serve as kind of corporate functions or communal functions. These are the functions that the church plays in the world to express the fullness of Jesus. And in order to help us achieve these functions, fulfill these functions, he gives each of us a gift. In the same way that in a finance department, you might have someone who has the gift of being really good at numbers. That's why they're in the finance department, and that's why they're adding value to that function within the organization. Or that smooth-talking salesperson is on your sales team because that's their gift, and they're becoming a gift to the organization by helping us sell our products. Christ gives these 5 gifts in the form of people who fulfill them. I think it's a really beautiful way of affirming a gift. You might have someone in your family, in your organization, and you recognize they have a gift, right? My wife has this gift of positivity or joyfulness all the time. And so one of the ways I might affirm her is by saying to her, you have such a gift of being joyful, or you have such a gift of positivity. When you speak that way, what you're really kind of saying is that this gift you have, which might even feel separate from you, that's the gift. Positivity is the gift, and you have it. But the way if I really wanted to affirm my wife, I'd say, honey, you are a gift. The way your positivity comes into an environment, the way you light up a room, you are a gift. And in that, it would be as if the identity of the person is really the thing that adds value, not just their behavior. That's what Paul's saying here. Rather than just saying, you, the guy with the gift of being an apostle, no. He's saying, you, the apostle, you are a gift. You, the prophet, you are a gift. You, the shepherd, you are a gift. You, the teacher, you are a gift. And then it says in there in verse 12 and 13, why do we have these gifts? These gifts are for equipping the church. They are literally the equipment. They're the stuff we need as a church on our journey, in our backpack. They're the equipment we need, the tools we need to express the fullness of Christ. I mean, for us to embody the fullness and maturity, we need to express these 5 essential functions or elements or ingredients or activities. Pick your plural noun, right? Paul picked one. He chose the word gifts. That's the way he describes these 5 things that we need in order to express the fullness of Christ. These gifts are the 5 elements of Jesus' mission that the church is called to fulfill, to express the fullness of Jesus' life. Now, this is usually the point in this message where people start getting a little shifty because of some of these terms. And depending on how much time you spent in church or what sort of denominational backgrounds you might come from, some of these terms might feel really loaded to you, specifically the term apostle and prophet. Most people are pretty good with shepherd and teacher. Like, yeah, that's fine. We don't care about those people. That's good. We get that. We know those. Evangelists, you're a little weird. But apostles and prophets is when I start like holding my money a little closer and kind of looking for the exits, you know. I mean, if I walked up to at a party and I said, hey, I'm Pastor John, people are like, yeah, cool. I said, hey, I'm John. I'm a teacher. Cool. If I start introducing myself as Apostle John, I'm not getting invited to parties anymore. It's just, it's done. And it's because over time, these words have become religious words in our culture. But the irony is, at the time when Paul's writing this, these are not religious words with the exception of one, prophet. These are just secular, common, everyday words. All right? He's borrowing from functions he sees in society to try to describe the essential functions that we need to have as a healthy organization. And Jesus is inspiring him to do this. So this is why I said I prefer the word shepherd to pastor, Basically, pastor is the Latin for shepherd, right? But shepherd helps us get to the essence of what he's talking about, which is shepherds care for sheep. The shepherding gift or the shepherding function was done by someone who went out and made it their job to care for the health of a flock of sheep. It's not the most complimentary thing to say that people are like sheep that need to be cared for, but it's a good analogy. He talks about an evangelist or the evangelistic gift. Evangelist comes from the Greek word for good news. Back then, the evangelist, right, was the person whose job it was to declare the good news that a king had come into power. If you remember thinking like old American images, we used to live in Colonial Williamsburg, and they had like the town crier. Hear ye, hear ye. He'd like ring the bell, That's an evangelist. He'd say, hey, gather around. I have good news. Come. You're going to want to hear the good news. That's what an evangelist is. So he goes, you know what the church needs? It needs that function of evangelism, declaring the good news. The apostle back then, an apostle was a person who was sent out on a mission. We might think of it today as like a diplomat or an emissary, someone that you give a task to, and then they represent you by going to a foreign land, kind of being a pioneer who sets out as a representative of the rest of the group. Only the term prophet had a religious connotation, and it wasn't just Christianity or Judaism that had prophets. Nearly every religion back then in their polytheistic world had a version of a prophet who would stand on the corner and say, I speak to you on behalf of Zeus, or I speak to you on behalf of Hermes. He has something he wants you to hear. The prophet was kind of the mouthpiece for God, but also the prophet would serve to kind of speak to God or the gods on behalf of the people. So there's a little bit of that kind of mediating role. I'll stand between the people and God, and I will make sure they communicate well with each other and they know each other's heart. So these are normal, everyday words that Jesus in the early church, they're borrowing to describe the functions and roles that they're playing in society. So try to strip out any kind of modern day cringiness that you might have over some of these terms and just kind of understand them as being illustrations or analogies for these functions that are important in society. Now, when I try to explain these sometimes and think about how do they function within the church, I was struggling early on to kind of put it into words. And I realized one of the best ways to communicate is through pictures. And while our family was living in Brussels, I stumbled across an image while we were teaching English at the local elementary school. We did like an after-school English club because the school was French. And I came across this image of a preposition circle. And what I learned was that when you're teaching English to kids, especially as they're learning prepositions, one of the best ways to do prepositions is to put them positionally around a circle, right? So the arrow into is going into the circle, out of is going out of the circle. I won't go any further. You get it, right? Okay. It's prepositions, okay? But I thought, that's a really fascinating idea. What if we took the idea of the church as a circle, this organism we are, the organization of the church, the body, and drew it as a circle, and then put the 5 functions, these 5 gifts, in and around the circle in a way that kind of represents their function. So I ended up drawing this. And let me just kind of walk through this as a way of explaining these gifts. The teaching gift, if this circle is kind of the body, the teaching gift is the gift that helps anchor the church. It creates legacy. It has traditions. It tells the stories from generation to generation. It's ultimately the part of us that keeps us biblically grounded and faithful and rooted to our foundational truths, right? You can see on that image just the thing that keeps us in contact with the ground so we don't just kind of go flying off in a new direction. That's not faithful. And then the S, the shepherding gift, is at the middle. It's the heart and soul of the church. It's the function in the church that reminds us to care for the health of one another, to look out for those who are hurting and heal them, to have an appreciation for nurture and support. When there are disagreements and people divide in the church, the shepherds are the one who say, no, come back. Let's reconcile our differences. Let's stay together and promote unity. And then the E, the evangelistic gift, that those who are the evangelists often live kind of on the edges. What they're doing is kind of inviting others in. Is the arrows coming in? Hey, come join us. Hey, let's make this circle wider. If you have an evangelist in your family, they're the ones who are always inviting people to your dinner party without telling you. You're like, hey, I invited our 3 neighbors over. And you're like, I don't have plates for 3 neighbors, but okay, get the leaf out. We'll put it in the table. I mean, this is what evangelists do. They want to expand the circle. They want to recruit people to the cause. And they do that often by telling the story in such a winsome way that others want to know more. And then that prophetic function, the P there, is on top. In the same way that an Old Testament prophet would often get up on a mountain to kind of get alone and even geographically imagine himself as kind of closer to God, the prophet kind of lives on top of this mountain, so to speak, and is particularly attuned to God. They're sensitive to God's Spirit and God's leading. They're willing to represent God's kind of truth to the community, and they're also willing to represent the community to God. But they also, throughout the Old Testament, you see that prophetic voice is often a voice of speaking against injustice, speaking for issues of mercy and compassion, for making sure that no one is being victimized in this community, for making sure that the paths are level for everyone, so to speak, and that there is an equality. And so that's part of the prophetic function. And then the last one there, the apostles. The apostles are on the front. The apostles are going fast. They're going further. They're extending. They want to take new ground. They're pioneers. The apostles were the ones in the New Testament. Paul would declare someone an apostle, and he would send them to a new place and say, listen, just do all the legwork, get it started, and once you get something going, we'll send you some shepherds and teachers and evangelists. And that literally happens in the book of Acts. They send apostles, and the apostles go back and go, okay, we got some stuff. Now we need some shepherds to care for these people, because you don't want apostles caring for people, trust me. Yeah. I know, I am one. That's why I married my wife. She's really good at it. So one of the things to notice in this picture is that notice how the ST function are kind of the center, the building function, the internal functions, whereas the APE, or in this one, the EPA functions, are kind of the bridging functions. They're on the outside. They're the ones that are extending the organization. Now, these are not titles that give people power. I'm not suggesting that any of you change your business card and say, I am now Apostle John, and I get to be an apostle, and you just have to take it, No. Paul's not talking about capital P prophets or capital A apostles, which is one of the reasons I prefer shepherd than pastor, because when you think of pastor, you still think of these two. And that's not what he's talking about. These two are actually more prophets than they are pastors, if you get to know them, okay? If they're going to put a capital letter, it's going to be on prophet. But think of not professional titles. Think of individual gifts that are being expressed in the life of the church. Each one of us with this supernatural gifting that we have in some areas more than others. But as we express this gift, we are working out, we are demonstrating Christ in the world. And the reason I'm so confident that all 5 of these gifts that Paul is talking about are not just unique to him, it's not like he made these up, is that if you look at the life of Jesus and just bring this picture back and just kind of lay it over the Gospels, Jesus is doing all 5 of these things. Jesus is fulfilling all 5 of these functions. He is a teacher. He goes into the synagogues. He teaches there. He goes up on the hillside to gather the masses. He teaches with authority. They say, we've never heard anyone teach with the authority that you teach with. He's the shepherd. He's healing lepers. He's weeping with women who have lost their brother. He's tenderly caring for people. He's inviting children to come to him with that sort of gentleness. He has compassion on the crowds, and he says, we've got to feed these people. He's got that shepherd nurturing impact. He's an evangelist. He invites people to follow him. He starts with 3, 5, 7, 12. By the end, after his resurrection, he visits with 500 people because he keeps adding to his numbers. He includes people who are often marginalized and are not invited in to religious spaces like women and children and the sick. He's a prophet. He stands up to the Pharisees and says, you got it wrong. You got God's heart all wrong. You're misrepresenting him. And so I might have to flip a table or two to get your attention, but let me set the record straight. This is what God cares about. And then at the same time, we find him sneaking away, and I guarantee part of what he's doing all alone is praying on behalf of the disciples. You see that at the end of John. Before I leave you, let me pray for you to my Father, because that's what prophets do. He raises the standard of morality. He says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Moses said, don't get divorced. I say, don't even commit adultery in your own heart. This is what prophets do. They raise the standard when it comes to behavior. And then finally, he's the apostle. He is the sent one. He goes into Samaria, an area that everyone went way out of their way to avoid. He goes to tax collectors. He takes in 12, and then he sends them out. And then he sends out 70. He's raising up the next generation of leaders and sending them as his representatives. That's what apostles do. And by displaying all 5 of these functions together, he's fully displaying the mission of God. He's not just a shepherd. He's not just a teacher, right? And yet one of the ironies in the American church, we'll talk about this at the end, is we tend to overemphasize those two things. How many times have you seen images of Jesus on on pictures, those old Renaissance posters they made, like walk through the Louvre or Google up images of Jesus, and what do you often see? You see Jesus with like a lamb around his neck, right? You see Jesus teaching. You don't see a lot of like kicking over table Jesus. Like I've always thought my son is a prophet. He's downstairs. I thought, you know what my son needs? He needs a poster of Prophet Jesus. Because he'll lay in bed and be like, yep, that's that's what I look like when I try to act like Jesus. I'm trying to get people to do what they're supposed to do and behave and belong and say, come on, guys, let's go. Get your act together. I'm going to raise the bar around here. That's exactly one of the things that Jesus did. Anyway, enough of that. Sorry, Jackson. It's easy to talk about you when you're not in the room anymore. All this to say, Paul's calling the church to act as one unified body, even while they express these 5 different functions, right? Unity amidst diversity, moving towards maturity. And so let me just finish the text. In verse 14, he finishes by saying, then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love. Don't miss this. As each part does its work. God's plan for mature growth in the church is each part doing his or her work. You don't get a healthy church by only 1 or 2 parts doing the work. You don't get a healthy church by only the professional parts doing the work. You don't get a healthy church by only having the parts do the work when they gather for an hour and a half, probably 2 today, the way I'm going, in this room on a Sunday morning. It's every part doing the work, not just when we gather, but when we scatter. That is how you express the healthy church. The apostolic parts, the prophetic parts, the evangelistic part, the shepherding part, the teaching part. That seems like an odd way to talk about a collection of people, so he just says, forget parts. It's the apostles, the prophets, the shepherds, the evangelists, the teachers. When they all do their work in truth and love, the body of Christ grows and matures. So let me just close by bringing all this back to just kind of a modern day application and come back to this idea of organizational health. TD and I talk often about this in our observation of churches and in the work that we've done when we meet on a weekly basis. But one of the things that we've noticed is that over the last 2,000 years of Christendom, partly because of the impact that we've had on culture and partly because of the dominance that Christianity has had, the local church has become kind of a poorly functioning body. That we tend to really only operate well with 2 parts, the shepherd part and the teaching part. We're really good at care, community, small groups, potlucks, right? Like we can gather some people and care for each other. And we're really good at the teaching part, this part. I mean, look how much time, even in this service, has been allocated for the teaching part of what we're doing. But those ape gifts, that apostle, prophet, evangelist, those ape gifts have kind of fallen to the wayside. And just imagine your human body if only 40% of the systems in your body were functioning well. I think you could lose like 1 system and feel bad. 2 systems, you're in the hospital. You lose 3 systems, you're flatlined. I hate to say it, but this is kind of what's happening to the American church in many ways, is we're kind of flatlining. Why? Because we're not representing the fullness of Christ. There's a version of churchianity that is just a shepherd-teacher expression. We're trying to reclaim the fullness of Christianity, which is Christ in all 5 functions in the middle. And so 2 simple applications to close with. 1, application, share your gift with the world. Shepherds and teachers, keep it up. Don't feel minimized. If that's kind of your primary orientation, we need that. Don't stop. But if you align more with that apostolic, that pioneering, or that prophetic, or that storytelling evangelistic gift, man, we need you. We need you when we gather. We need you when we scatter. We need you in leadership here at Media City. We need those gifts more than ever to fulfill the fullness of Jesus. Maybe you're sitting here going, I don't really know what I am. You're talking about it as if it's a blood test or something. I mean, how would I just figure it out? Well, the good news is Media City has created a tool, a GPS tool, to help identify these gifts in you. You can go on the app or you can scan the QR code in the back and you can take this test. I'm primarily an apostle evangelist. This week, the staff updated the entire website with all of their primary giftings. So you can kind of go and see what's represented by these staff. But find out what you are so you know what gift you can give. And then to close, the second one, celebrate the different gifts you see in others. When you see someone doing something that's different from you, celebrate it, honor it, collaborate with it. We're not in competition. We want all 5 gifts functioning together. Unity amidst diversity, moving towards maturity. That's how we express the fullness of Christ. Let's close with just our brief time of reflection as we do each week. And maybe even in this time, as we think about the questions that'll be overhead, maybe God will affirm in you how you can be his gift to the world even this week.